All right. It looks like we have a good number of folks in with us today. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us as we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Los Angeles 92 Uprising, also known as Saigu 429. My name is Daniela Lazaro-Manalo, and I am the Racial Equity Education and Advocacy Coordinator with Mennonite Central Committee, US. You know, when we first began planning this event, one of the early questions that we sat with was, so what? Why is this important now? And does it still matter today? 30 years ago, on April 29th, 1992, a jury acquitted 4 LAPD officers of brutally beating Rodney King. And the uprising that ensued in the city of Los Angeles would last 5 days. The protesting, looting, burning, and civil unrest set the whole city ablaze and resulted in 63 deaths and thousands of businesses destroyed, with Korean-owned businesses accounting for 45% of the $1 billion property damage. For those that were around to witness this historical moment, they may be well aware of the ways the city has been marked by these events. For those that learned of the trial and the aftermath later, the lasting impact may not seem as evident. Yet, as we near the second anniversary of George Floyd's murder, we cannot help but feel the tug of those connections. As we lay witness to the viral videos and images of ongoing police brutality, Asian hate crimes, children in cages, whippings at the border, we cannot help but acknowledge that the atrocities and traumas live with us and drain themselves into so many fragments of our daily lives. And there is a discomfort that comes with coexisting with these ghosts that won't let us forget. But there is also a responsibility that lies with us. The weight of the haunting that requires us to say her name, to say his name, to say their name. It is the courage and boldness in standing together that brings us here today and creates a sacred, safe place for our voices and stories to be shared. So thank you all for being here with us tonight. I'd like to share a couple of logistics before the evening gets started. Please note that tonight's webinar is being recorded. And for our format tonight, we will have 2 speakers who will give us the framework and language to see what is happening, both past and present. We'll have panelists share their stories, some time for question and answer, and finally we'll end with announcements. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sue.
Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see many familiar faces, as well as those who I have not had the pleasure to meet. Glad that we are here together, and especially with wonderful friends. Today, I wanted to, and feel honored to introduce dear friends that we have invited to this space, people who have done the work, have put their feet on the ground, especially in Los Angeles, as well as across the country, to help us frame the many hauntings that we will talk about. Today, I wanted to first introduce you to Elaine and Ched, who joins us from Ventura River watershed in the traditional land of the Chumash territory. Many of you know their work. Elaine is a Canadian Mennonite, educator, writer, facilitator, and trainer in conflict transformation. She has worked in the field of restorative justice since 1989. Some of you weren't even born then. And she focuses on how restorative justice applies to historical violations, including issues of intergenerational trauma and healing. And in addition to her newest book, Healing Haunted Histories, that she co-wrote with her partner, Ched Myers, she published 2 volumes, Ambassadors of Reconciliation. They also both co-direct Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries that many of us are familiar with. We also know Ched Myers, an ecumenical activist theologian, a popular educator, writer, teacher, organizer, most of all, a committed animator of scripture, nurturing church renewal and radical discipleship, and supporting faith-based movements, a real movement person for peace and justice rooted in faith. Many of his books we've read them all. I think I have all of his books in our shelves, but the book that I think many of us are most familiar might be Finding the Strong Man, political reading of Mark's story of Jesus, which he wrote 35 years ago. Again, some of you weren't even born then, but it continues to enliven and animate theologians and lay people around the world, and has been translated in many languages, including in Korean. In addition to all their impressive, their impressive background, they have been dear friends, mentors, and colleagues that we feel privileged to walk alongside. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for changing your schedule around so that you can be fully present with us today. Welcome, Elaine and Ched.
Thank you so much, Sue. We are again so grateful to partner with ReconciliAsian to commemorate Saigu, as we did together 5 years ago for the 25th anniversary. It really is an honor to get to do this work together. And thanks to all of you. It's always fun to scroll through the gallery and see who has all joined us tonight. Thanks very much for taking part of your Friday evening to be with us. And of course, we want to give greetings and hope all of you had a wonderful Earth Day today.
We Christians have just come through Holy Week and Easter. And we often forget that in Luke's story, the raucous Palm Sunday parade celebrating the hope of new possibilities concludes with Jesus breaking down in bitter wailing as he overlooks the city of Jerusalem. Jesus both sees the violence of injustice within the city and foresees the violence that would eventually come upon it from without. So we want to start out our short presentation tonight by recalling that painful and poignant gospel moment and how it so profoundly illuminates our own history here in Los Angeles, because we too are a city that does not fully recognize the things that make for peace. As Daniela said, 1 week from today, we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the Los Angeles Uprising, the largest civil disturbance in the history of the United States, and an urban rebellion that had a huge impact on all of Los Angeles's communities.
So we gather to remember this history and its legacy, mindful of our mentor Vincent Harding's wisdom that all social movements of liberation begin with memory. We do this in order to face unresolved traumas which shape the continuing landscape of injustice today in the City of Angels, and because we are still haunted by the personal and political violence that gave rise to Saigu. To frame tonight's conversation, we want to draw on a key idea of our recent book on decolonization entitled Healing Haunted Histories, and that is so poignantly recontextualized in Hae-Yoon Song's Art Here, which we'll hear more about a little bit later. UC Santa Barbara sociologist Avery Gordon, in her 1997 book, Ghostly Matters, asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they're supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change, but only as our hauntings are faced and healed.
To illustrate what is meant here, we need to look no further than the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis policeman almost 2 years ago, which again, Daniela has already invoked. As you are all aware, this brought up yet again the ghosts of a long-standing history of violence toward Black and brown bodies in our white dominant American body politic. This powerful haunting spread across time and space, even as far away as war-torn Syria, but also as close as Los Angeles, where protests against Floyd's murder and ongoing police violence erupted as well, bringing back, quote, the ghosts of Rodney King and Watts, as the New York Times put it.
In a similar vein, just over a month ago, we commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the horrible murders of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian American women in the Atlanta spa shootings. Our American landscape is indeed full of ghosts, especially those lingering from centuries of racism. This is why it is important to take time to remember, to reassess, and to renew our commitment to healing and restorative solidarity. So let us recap the origins of Saigu. On March 3rd, 1991, Rodney King, an African-American motorist, was pulled over by Los Angeles police officers after leading them on a high-speed chase. Once pulled out of the car and put on the ground, King was beaten severely by 4 officers. A bystander famously videotaped much of the incident from a distance. Over a year later, on April 29th, 1992, a jury in a Simi Valley court composed of, quote, 10 whites, 1 Hispanic, and 1 Asian, after 7 days of testimony and deliberation, acquitted 3 of the officers and hung on one of the charges for the 4th. Within hours, riots went off around Los Angeles County and spread to other cities around the country. And over the course of 4 days, 63 people lost their lives amid the looting and fires that ravaged the city. 10 were shot to death by law enforcement officials. An additional 44 people died in other homicides or incidents tied to the uprising. 14 were white. 2 were Asian, a Vietnamese and a Korean. 28 were Black, and 19 were Latinx. The uprising destroyed or damaged over 1,000 buildings in the LA area. Approximately 3,600 fires were set, with fire calls coming once every minute at some points. The estimated cost of the damages was over $1 billion. Some 9,800 California National Guard troops were deployed to take control of the situation. 3 days after the violence began, federal troops from the 7th Infantry Division and the United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division were also sent in. Soldiers stayed in some areas of LA for almost a month.
Nearly 12 people were arrested, mostly directly related to the rioting. The violence particularly impacted the Korean community in Los Angeles, though widely ignored by the press, a part of the story that ReconciliAsian and ourselves and some others focused on 5 years ago in our commemoration. As a young activist, I was on the streets of Northwest Pasadena with the We Care Community Coalition during the violence, trying to keep the peace while working for justice, using the now famous slogan of the uprising, a slogan that echoes Jesus' lament over Jerusalem about knowing the things that make for peace. But 1992 was the second time many of us had seen our city burn, because Los Angeles, a city of angels, is also a city of ghosts. The first time was August 11th to the 15th, 1965, when LA burned for 3 days in reaction, see if this sounds familiar, to the beating of a black man by white cops after a routine traffic stop. I was 10 years old at the time. I can still remember the acrid smell in the air. During the Watts Rebellion, 35 people were killed, 900 injured, and property losses were at $250 million. Federal troops were called in to occupy our city then, too. One of a string of summer urban riots throughout the decade, Watts' 1965 became a national symbol for Black unrest and white suppression. It reminded the nation, if only for a moment, of the inevitable violence that sooner or later erupts when and where justice is lacking. A few days after Martin Luther King Jr. came to town and was deeply moved by the conversations he had here about systemic civil rights violations, economic injustice, and racial discrimination. A riot, King said famously, is the language of the unheard.
But the roots and hauntings go even deeper in this city. Beneath the soil and concrete of Los Angeles are three broad layers of history. First, thousands of years of indigenous sovereignty and flourishing. Then, the history of European conquest and colonization, beginning with the violence and displacement during the Spanish and Mexican period from 1769 to 1846. And then the third layer is the last 175 years of American domination, industrial development, and forced assimilations of peoples. These strata often look like this image, San Andreas Fault, which shows tortured bends and twists due to tectonic forces. This symbolizes the traumatic labyrinths that marginalized people have to navigate to survive. And we'll give brief examples from this stratigraphy of hauntings. Spanish colonization brought disease, forced labor, habitat loss, and cultural repression for the indigenous Tongva communities of the place we now call Southern California, facilitated in large part by the mission system. This Holocaust has recently been documented by Native scholar Elias Castillo's work, published as a counter to the canonization of Father Sarah by the Catholic Church. There was resistance, most famously from the Tongva medicine woman Toy Farina, whose image haunts this wall in East LA today. And of course, the Tongva still survive among us and are rebuilding their culture.
And there's another haunting. The first group of pobladores, colonists, who came up from Mexico to settle what they called El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles sobre el Río de la Porciúncula, were in fact a very diverse group. 1 mestizo, 2 negros, 8 mulattos, 9 indios, and only 2 European Spaniards. So from its beginnings, Los Angeles exhibited multicultural roots, as celebrated in Judy Baca's mural here. But over the ensuing 2.5 centuries, we have not nearly fully realized this promise. Quite the opposite. After California was taken over by Americans, it was heavily marketed to Eastern white folks, and its population began to double every decade. So by 1930, city fathers boasted LA as the whitest, most Protestant city in the United States. We're looking at a tourist map of Los Angeles from 1940. The smaller legend in the middle lists the, quote, foreign colonies in the city, including Negro, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Russian, Jewish, Italian, Mexican, Indian, Serb, and Czechoslovakian neighborhoods, so that WASPs could avoid these dangerous communities. Many neighborhoods routinely practiced attaching restrictive housing covenants to property deeds. Highland Park, where we used to live, once posted "No Asian" signs at the border of the town. And South Pasadena, where I grew up, prohibited Blacks and Mexicans from residing there for decades. In LA, class and race apartheid was also reinforced by decades of redlining, the practice of banks refusing to do mortgage lending in certain neighborhoods, which was even mandated by certain federal loan programs, as indicated in this 1935 FHA document. If you were Mexican, you simply couldn't live west of the LA River, hence East LA is still synonymous with Latino culture. If you were Black, similarly, you didn't cross north of Adams. And there were both official and unofficial initiatives that enforced such racist codes, such as the infamous so-called Zoot Suit riot during World War II, in which white servicemen roamed Echo Park beating up Mexicans, or the internment of Japanese Americans. Today, LA is the 6th most segregated city in the United States.
And here's yet another ghost. LA used to have one of the best public transportation systems in the US. Beginning in the 1930s, it began to be steadily dismantled by federal and city managers and oil and automobile interests, which conspired to re-engineer LA's social architecture into the car culture that it is today. Astor car ran in 1961, and particularly hard hit was the Watts neighborhood, where many working folk couldn't get to work anymore, contributing directly to the uprising several years later. During that same era, so-called urban redevelopment functioned to clear out poor neighborhoods from the city core. Meanwhile, the city was reconstructed on a massive freeway grid to accommodate cars commuting for white-collar workers from increasingly far-flung suburbs. Freeways like the 5, 10, and the 105 were rammed right through poor communities, dividing and destroying them. Transportation apartheid in LA continued to deepen after the Watts uprising, with the managerial class commuting by car, the middle class by a new but limited light rail network, and the working class poor by a deteriorating and crowded bus system.
Sweet Alice Harris was a community organizer based in Watts since the 1950s. I met her at a 25th anniversary forum on the Watts riots in 1990. At one point, she was asked why the riots broke out in 1965. Because the cup of oppression just kept filling up, she said, and it finally overflowed. And then she looked out and said, and it's filling up again, and it's about to overflow again. And sure enough, less than 2 years after that prophecy, in 1992, Los Angeles did burn again. This is what happens when we don't look deep enough into the soil of our history to learn the stratigraphy of injustice from generation to generation. The hauntings just keep returning. So we close with a quote from another wise African-American elder of blessed memory, poet Maya Angelou. History, she wrote decades ago, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And that, friends, is why we've gathered this weekend, to heal our hauntings by facing our ghosts with courage, working for gospel justice right here on Tongva land in order to realize that multicultural promise seated along the banks of the Rio Porciúncula.
So we have three panelists tonight. And we have cited Avery Gordon's argument that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life, through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. But Gordon also asserts that reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change. And so we want to put before you three related questions. One, what ghosts of past or present oppression did you and or your family carry when you arrived in Los Angeles? Two, what ghosts did you encounter here in the haunted landscapes of Los Angeles? And how has this helped you understand Saigu? And third, how have your experiences of facing these hauntings helped animate the work for restorative solidarity? So Sue, we will turn it over to you.
And before we shift to the panelists, I wanted us to take a deep breath because I think these images and these quotes may have stirred some things in our bodies. And as we are talking about all these things, all these hauntings, I wonder how your body has been reacting. I could feel my gut kind of shaking and feeling something deep. I feel my shoulders and the weight of it feeling a little bit heavier. And so just be aware of how your body and your emotions are responding as we continue to have this difficult, courageous conversation together. And before we kind of shift to our panelists, I wanted us to pay attention to an art piece that our staff, an artist, Hei Yoon Song, has created for this event that I wanted to share with you. She cannot be with us today, but she wanted to share her artwork. And so Daniela, would you mind sharing this piece? Thank you so much. And I'll read what she has, what she was trying to capture with this very difficult call to heal and to also name our hauntings. And so she wrote, this poster is dedicated to Saigu, an event that many communities, bodies, land, and city at an unease. I wanted to defy the dominant perspective of this event that left a mark on many lives, and to use dichotomies between the past and present, visible and invisible, and reality and mythology to evoke many perspectives from those who witnessed and heard. The image of this poster was interpreted as Black and white silhouettes who linger in the landscape of Los Angeles. She said, I wanted to use this fundamentals of stenciling technique in screen printing using positive and negative spaces to bridge the material and conceptual narratives. The figures who remain as white silhouettes, the cutouts from the Black curtain backdrops, are subjects drawn from images of the LA uprising. So these cutouts are actual images that she saw from photographs of the uprising. It was important to blur the lines between the imagery that will be perceived as those who are running away or running towards something, while the figures of the past exist in the shadows of escaping towards prospect and hope. The figures in the back, you see the Black silhouettes, are many voices of activism triggered by the current unrest and showed up to protest and remember this day. So this is how she connects the past and the present. What's also intriguing is this typeface of the font that she used that is called Martin on the top and Marsha at the bottom, both from the vocal type designed by an African-American designer, Trey Seals. The font Martin is named after Martin Luther King Jr. and was specifically inspired by the poster that many of us are familiar with, I Am a Man. So it is the same font from that poster. from the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. Marcia, the print beneath, is named after the African-American transgender woman, Marcia P. Johnson, who was prominent for her activism in the Stonewall Uprising of 1968. These two typefaces are nonviolent, but bear stories of the African-American past and introduce minority culture and design. She also wanted to talk about trauma through this, if you can see at the bottom, this uprootedness, right? This replanting and being traumatized in this replanting in a new land for many of us immigrants. And so she had put those roots to symbolize that. And even though maybe we were running away from something, that there is still remnant of hope that we want to bear witness to. So these are the many beautiful interpretation, and I'm sure that as you are seeing this, that you will also see new things that that you may not have, that she may not have even mentioned. So we wanted to just honor her art, as well as the integral piece of healing comes through art, as many of us know. And so wanted to recognize her art, as well as many artists of past and present that continues to be, continues to heal us and prophesy of things that have been and can be. So thank you. Thank you, Heyun. Now, we have the honor to listen to our panelists today. We wanted to just also note that Stanley Green was supposed to be here, and he cannot be here, unfortunately. He's in a wonderful retreat camp in Camp Friesenwald, is that how I say it? And they have very limited internet connection, and so he's there for a retreat to be with other pastors, and so that was something that we were not prepared for and we found out, and so I know some of us wanted to really hear his interpretation and his story today, but we're just really grateful that we have the Reverend Dr. David Moore here with us. He is an ecumenical teacher and author, the lead pastor of New Covenant Worship Center and the Jesus Collective. He had earned his master's degree from St. Stephen's University in New Brunswick, Canada, and holds his theology of doctorate from the University of South Africa. And so David is here, and I think he has some stories to share as well. And he joins us from the land of the Chumash people. He's married to Diane and have been married for 38 years, maybe more, since the last time that I've heard, and has 5 adult children. We also want to welcome our lovely Daniela Lazaro-Manalo, who introduced and opened our time for us. She serves as the Racial Equity Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Mennonite Central Committee. Some of you may have are familiar not only with the organization and may have heard about her new role, and today you had the opportunity to meet her. She's passionate about racial justice, equity, community mobilization, and the multiple interdisciplinary understanding of identity formation in the US. And Daniela lives in Los Angeles with her husband and her beautiful son. And my name is Sue Park-Hur. This is a late introduction. I work for the Mennonite Church as the Director of Racial Ethnic Engagement. This is a new title for me, so I have to get used to this. And I co-direct ReconciliAsian, a peace center here in Los Angeles. And next year marks our 10th year anniversary as a peace center. So we celebrate that as well. The 3 of us come from different places, but we wanted to share our stories as from an intergenerational, interracial perspective, because our stories were not told well 30 years ago, and our stories continue to be silenced. and marginalized. And so we wanted to create space where our voices and our stories could be heard. So I will begin by reflecting on some of the pertinent questions that Elaine and Ched has given to us. So the coast of past and present that our family carried with us. I was born in South Korea, in Seoul. But this ghost is one that goes before I was born. My father was 17 when the Korean War broke out, and he was 17 years old. So he was at the very, very young age and the minimal age to take up arms and to fight really his brothers and sisters from a different, from the same land, right? And him being a gentle man, this had an impact on him to see so much violence when he was so young. And so my father, later on, we found out later, much later, when we had the words of true haunting, he had PTSD and this unresolved war, this forgotten war, a war that still has not ended after 72 years, continued to live within my father and his mental state. This lack of closure impacted his mental health. And he actually, one of the things that he suffered from was auditory hallucinations, where he heard voices of his superiors telling him where to go. And so he would, when he had his episodes, I remember being in the car and he would drive in very, different, we're supposed to go home and he wouldn't go home and he would hear voices. And it was a very scary experience that was unfortunately too often experienced. Compounded onto that historical trauma of war and the stigma of mental illness, my family could not talk about this with others because there still continues to be a stigma in a culture that is a saving face culture. And so when my father's sister invited us to come to America in 1980, and in 1980, Korea was under unelected military dictatorship of Chun Doo-hwan. I remember curfews when I was 7 and 8 years old. And so during this time of political uncertainty, we came with a hope to start anew, to live the American dream, and to be grateful to start over. But this fracture and this trauma that we have had from our past doesn't go away at the borders. This trauma we carry to this new country, a country with new vision, but not knowing that there was a nightmare that was awaiting for us in this country. So this kind of leads me to the second question of what are the hauntings that we encountered here in Los Angeles? For my family, the issue of racism was big, right? In fact, oftentimes people would say, who are you or what are you? They would, kids would tease and they would try to say, you're Chinese, you Chinese. And I would say, I'm not Chinese, I'm not Japanese. And this question of what are you persisted with me. People didn't know how to categorize me and dismiss me and dismiss my history and the culture that I came from. Not knowing kind of where I came from, people would say, go back to your country, not knowing the history of war. And in fact, if I could talk to those people again, I would say, well, I came, I am here because you were there. And this weight of being a child of an immigrant, stayed with me, this code switching, the in-between worlds, being in both, but never fully belonging into one. And so you kind of have to grow up early and hold on to not only the weight of the emotional and mental stress that you're going through, but also the mental and emotional stress that your parents are going through. And so I won't tell my parents about my problems because I just need to do right and to be that model minority and to live and be successful and do the right things. And I did, I was active at school. I went to the right schools. And then when I was a sophomore in college, the 1992 Saigu event erupted and everything was a mess. There was so much confusion. Some of you may have seen pictures of Korean roofmen on top of buildings holding guns, and it was really difficult to understand what was going on. I think now in hindsight, I understand what was really happening. Notice that just like my father, many of those elders who are now elders or may have passed away had their ghosts, and they knew how to use guns because they all were trained to be soldiers. And when their livelihood, everything that they lived for, all the sacrifices that they've made to come here was endangered, their fight mode really activated. And my father as well. Our store was on the corner of Vermont and Hollywood, quite away from South Central, but my father somehow got a gun and he went to the rooftop and was trying to protect us, recognizing, again, this is when he was having his episodes. And so this was a very scary time. My mother passed away just a few years ago. And so again, my fear, wanting to protect my father, also activated, and it was a difficult time. My best friend had a store. Her parents had a store on Olympic and Western, which was very, very different from where I was. It was a real war zone where she was, whereas there was no protection by the police. But for where my parents had of their store near Hollywood and Vermont, it was protected because there were hospitals. And so our stories are very, very different. And the only lifeline where we could really understand what was happening was through Radio Korea. They were telling the stories of what was really happening. And that was the lifeline of that is a story that was not being told in the media. And so we recognized quickly that we need to tell our stories. We need to speak up and connect in ways that we were unable to in the past. I could go on, but I'm just going to shift so that you can hear stories from different people, and maybe I'll come back to add to my story as well. I'd like to invite David to share his story.
Thank you, Sue. And sorry to hear that you had to be the defender of your dad, probably in more ways than one. The ghosts. First of all, I'd like to talk about the ghosts of Christianity. The Saturday after the uprising, Saigu, subsided, I drove to Los Angeles. I've been living in Santa Barbara all these years, but I drove to Los Angeles to meet with a group of pastors, mostly African American, at West Angeles Church on Crenshaw Boulevard. There were about 150 pastors there who gathered with the intent to demand accountability from the chief of police and the LAPD. Just a few days after that, I was invited to another gathering of pastors here in Santa Barbara. All of them were white. And to my dismay, I discovered that the reason we were there for this prayer meeting was to reinforce our care and support for law enforcement. And needless to say, my experience with local police was profoundly different than theirs. And this ghost of false Christianity is very active in this moment in our shared zeitgeist. This oppressive, pro-oppression kind of a ghost is very present among us. The second ghost is the ghost of forgetting. Well over a decade after the uprising, I have a friend who had a friend that was part of the rescue team, if you want to call it that. You may remember the name Reginald Denny. He was, there were 4 Black men that were pummeling him and torturing him. Basically, he was a truck driver who was pulled out of his truck and viciously beaten. But then there were 3 other people that came and brought aid to Reginald Denny, maybe saving his life. And one of them was a woman by the name of Lee Yule. And I found her through another friend, and I invited her to come speak to our churches. And at that time, we were between facilities and we were meeting at Westmont College, a Christian college not far from here. And it just so happened that that was one of the Sundays that Lee was with me. And also a number of the students attended that church service that we had there. And the mood in the room was, they were so resistant. And it occurred to me 20 years later, some of them probably don't even know about Rodney King and the uprising, this gathering of young white college students. And I felt responsible. I felt like I had been irresponsible by exposing Lee to that environment, because she was still suffering from PTSD, all of those years later. The thing is that before I took Lee to Westmont, I took her to another church that at that time I was leading in Oxnard, which was predominantly Black and brown, and they celebrated her presence. So again, that too is not just the ghost of forgetting, but also the ghost of false Christianity on display. And my final ghost that I'll introduce to you two tonight, on July 7th, just 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, 2016, I was sitting in this room where I am right now at my computer, and there's a television in the background. And on my TV, there was coverage of a sniper in Dallas. Earlier that same week, we had seen 2 African-American men killed by police on camera, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And it was their deaths that raised tensions around the country. And if that were not enough, this tense situation was now playing out on CNN, because there was a Black Lives Matter protest going on. And the officers showed up because there was a report of a Black man who was shooting, active shooter. And this man actually ended up killing some of those police officers. And later we would find out from Police Chief David Brown that this man was upset about Black Lives Matter. And he said that he was upset about the recent shootings, police shootings. The suspect said he was upset at white people. And the suspect stated he wanted to kill white people, especially white officers. Now, while the reported shootout, I'm looking at my TV, and while the shootout was still underway, a text message appears on my computer screen. My son, Jared, asked me, "Dad, is there a war between Black people and police?" And my eyes were already clouded with tears when I typed, "Stay safe, son." The reason I was so emotional is because this same son, Jared, 25 years earlier as a 6-year-old, walked into our living room to see me watching television coverage of Rodney King being brutally beaten by the police in LA. And little Jared looked at me and asked, "Daddy, are they going to do that to you?" So then a quarter of a century later, and it was highly questionable to me whether the world I was giving my children would be better than the one I inherited. And I cried very hard that night. I cried so hard, I got a migraine. I got no sleep. Thank you all for listening. Oh, well, finally, I will say this, that if there's anything that I draw from the experience, it is to affirm that bumper sticker many of you have seen that says "subvert the dominant paradigm," because the dominant paradigm is absurd, but it has become so normalized that we accept it. But I'm living passionately to subvert it. Thank you all. Daniela.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend David. That was powerful. I am coming into this story a little bit later. My family and I migrated to the US in 1994. And I grew up here in Los Angeles, born in Trujillo, Peru. I was 3 years old at the time when we came over. And we carried ghosts. I later came to know intimately the ghosts that my parents carried, and the ways in which they were fed with the ghosts that we encountered here on this landscape. We arrived thinking that there would be a safety net in place, but quickly found what could probably only be called as maybe a human trafficking trap that led to us entering this country illegally. And in that process, we came into contact with the haunting of criminalization, of being illegal in this country for several years, and similarly putting us in contact with the haunting presence of police and the ways that our bodies were being criminalized, quickly disrupting the illusion of the American dream, the illusion that we could escape financial crisis, and that this dream was accessible to people that looked like us. And so in the midst of that, I parallel a lot of the experiences that Sue has highlighted, the sense of displacement, the not being, the neither here nor there, the existing in the in-between. And as I think about ghosts that we brought with us, I think I want to highlight my mom. We often joke that if there was a zombie apocalypse, Mama Pati, who's now Grandma, Mommy would survive. If there was anybody that was going to survive that incident, it would be Mom, because she is scrappy and knows how to survive. And it's only recently that we've engaged in some conversations where she revealed to me that so much of the abuse and some of the difficulties of her childhood, she's come to realize came from recognizing that her father and his siblings lost their parents at a very young age. And so when they were being brought up, there was there was this weight of being able to know how to survive should anything happen. And that was with my grandfather and my grandmother, who experienced loss of parents at early ages, and she grappled with it much later in life. But I even just reckoning with that story and the way that we encountered the Los Angeles landscape and the ways that she immediately switched gears into helping us survive this space. We're certainly informed by those ghosts and those hauntings, but that in so many ways did enable us to survive, to eventually obtain citizenship in this country. I think that one of the things that I experienced growing up in Los Angeles was there's really so much diversity here. There are really so many cultures, and those of us that live in communities that maybe aren't quite as suburban don't necessarily encounter racism in some of the more traditional overt ways that we've heard about in history. But we enter this space and quickly learn to navigate how we are being read, which groups congregate together and which groups don't. That segregation is ever present in schools and in our cities. And but at the same time, there's such a convergence of these cultures as well. And so sometimes there's almost an illusion that there's a sense of where does the right racism lie, and where are we post-racial or are we not, which we certainly are not. But I think that it highlights, it's just experienced differently, and we may not have the language for it right away, but I think it highlights, and this ties back to well, capitalism just at the very inception, but we're put in competition with each other, right? Since the very inception of this country, there's this commodification that happens with bodies of color, with Black bodies, brown bodies, migrant bodies. And so we come to understand ourselves and value ourselves in terms of labor and productivity and profitability, and it gets convoluted and it gets messy because suddenly we're caught in the midst of meritocracy, and if I have access to those resources and suddenly you're claiming those resources, then I'm losing power, and so much of the strife that happens and the tension that happens occurs because we're looking at the power differential amongst ourselves, and that is the way that the system works. It is subversive, and we don't think to look. Sometimes it is so distracting, it is so overwhelming, and it is so traumatic, and we harm ourselves in the process that we don't see the ways in which white supremacy is sometimes gaslighting us. Well, is always gaslighting us. And so that is sort of the context in which I come to understand Saigu, the LA Uprising, as I think about our communities and how we move forward. I think about how do we find ourselves by facing these hauntings? How do we hold our ghosts? How do we sometimes care for them? How do we release some of them? And how do we in the midst of that, make space and carve out space for us to grow, to find ourselves and find a reason to feed and nurture instead our joy, nurture instead a whole different set of things, and tap into the positive things that survived. I believe that there are knowledges and technologies that were transposed and hidden in the realm of the spiritual, the same way that the ghosts and the hauntings that happen and the weight of everything that that we carry, I think we do well to remember that what of the spirits of resistance, what of the spirits of resilience, the spirits of courage, of a good sense of humor, of transformation. How do we free ourselves and confront our ghosts just long enough to find those? Because I truly believe that we hid so much more in the realm of the spiritual than sometimes we're confronted with, and we move forward in recognition that our liberation is bound together. And I think that doing that might just mean working outside of the existing framework that we have in society and envisioning something new.
Thank you, Daniela. You have heard some stories, just glimpses of the stories, the hauntings, the questions that we hold. If you have any, well, I wanted to ask you before we open up for questions and answers, Daniela and David, how have your experience of facing these hauntings helped animate your work for restorative solidarity? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I will just say it has augmented my passion for what I mentioned earlier, to subvert the dominant paradigm, to question everything, to question authority in particular.
Yeah, I would echo that, and peeling back those layers, always peeling back those layers and looking just beneath what were the narratives that we're being fed. You know, how do we get to the truth? That's always the question for me. Where is the truth, and where does that lie? And let's meet there.
Right. The question of power is something that we're all talking about. How do we work with that? How do we realize the power we have and the power that has narrated who we are and narrated the way that we understand ourselves? And this is where the internalized racism also that we're also naming, in the way that we see one another plays out. It's a rare opportunity, but I'm excited that we can create spaces like this where we're centering our own stories, right? And it seems so, it should happen in a space like LA, where people, a Latina and a Black man and an Asian woman can come together and have these kinds of conversations. But it's not easy. And these kinds of spaces are the places where restorative work can happen. And so we just want to expand and challenge all of us to continue to do this work of naming power, naming our hauntings, and naming the healings, the possibilities as well.
I would suggest one avenue towards healing is very primal, and that is dancing. Dancing tells the dominant paradigm in your face.
Mm.
And so conscious dancing is mystical. And so everybody here, you know, some people will have the excuse, well, I'm not a very good dancer. Says who? You're the dancer. You be your own judge and give yourself high scores every time, because it comes from a deep place. And this is how we will overcome.
And tomorrow, if you are here local, we will dance. Maybe Tim could bring his music, and there are others who can come, and we will have some music, and we will eat together. I think the way that we resist is also, have joy and celebrate, right? That we are still here, In spite of all of the oppressions that we've experienced, we are here. Do we have any questions from our friends? And we have friends from across the country, actually, who are here from Japan. We have people from East Coast as well as from the Midwest. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself or raise your hand and we can get to you as well. And as we wait, Elaine and Chet, do you have any thoughts, observations? Feel free to jump in anytime.
We just want to thank each of the panelists for such poignant and vulnerable sharing. And we're constantly amazed at the way in which framing the history we carry and the history we inherit and the places we carry and inherit, how framing that in terms of hauntings can evoke such deep spiritual awareness and social analysis. So each of you have done that beautifully. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add too, I'm just grateful for the talking about the practices of resilience too. And David, I could not agree with you more. I'm a Mennonite and I still claim that I got some moves, you know, that's us white Mennonites. I would say white Mennonites struggle with dancing, but anyways, why would I say that? David, thank you. And Daniela, you too talked about beautiful practices of strength and courage and resilience. And we talk about that in terms of our song lines. What are the things that inspire us to stand up for justice, that inspire us to act courageously, that allow us to shed the things that constrict us? So you both also spoke to that beautifully, so thank you.
There's a question from other dancing Mennonites from the East Coast. Thank you for your stories and reflections. How do we address false Christianity? Oof. Let's leave with a really light question like that. How do we address false Christianity? I think, David, that's something that you had also mentioned.
I think we're doing it in this moment. And we really need to be intentional about connecting with people who live in good faith. We really need to make sure I'm going to go as far as to say we need to up our game. And being, if I may be so presumptuous, we need to up our game when it comes to being in one another's presence, you know, even if it's virtual. This is happening right now. I mean, you just mentioned you have people here from the East Coast and Japan, that kind of thing. We just need to do this.
I also think the way that we can address false Christianity is to this ghost of silence when there are difficult questions, because we always feel like we have to have an answer as Christians. We feel like everything has to be neatly packaged in a way that we have understood, that we continue to. And there are, of course, things that we need to continually affirm and have that foundation. But if we do have those foundations, we can hold the questions. Daniela gave a litany of questions, right, towards the end of her talk. To hold them, knowing that we don't have all of the answers, I think that's true Christianity. I think it's to recognize that we wrestle with uncertainty. That's where our faith is required. If we have all the right answers for everything, we do not need our faith. And so the way that we ask for the Holy Spirit, if we feel like we have all the answers, that is false Christianity.
I'd like to echo David's assessment that we are in the process of doing that as we speak tonight. ReconciliAsian, ourselves, and a handful of others have kind of embraced as a spiritual discipline to the discipline of remembering this commemoration of this incredibly apocalyptic moment that was Saigu, particularly for those of us who went through it. Memory and testimony are two foundations of our traditional faith. Do this in memory of me, says Jesus. This is a tradition of memory. And our most powerful theological voice is testimony. And you've heard that from Daniela and David and Sue. And so I'm just very grateful for this as a constructive gathering. But we have to be intentional about it. And I hope more and more of us will embrace this discipline. And that when we're looking at the 35th anniversary, we'll have a broader circle.
I have a question. Sue, I have a question.
Yes.
I think Martin Luther said our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matters. And to me, this is one of the things that matters that we are talking about tonight. But where are our young adults? I'm 60 plus. I don't know all your ages. They are the generations that will change the world. 10 years ago, I was serving the Mennonite Church, Pacific Southwest Mennonite Conference moderator. And my son called me. Dad, what are you doing? I said, I'm having a meeting with these Anglos, Mennonite. He said, don't call them Anglos, they're your brothers. It was a real shock to me that my 16-year-old son would say that to me, how I categorize people. So I think this kind of webinars, seminars, teaching needs to go to our younger generations that will carry the baton forward. We have lived it, but they need to learn from the mistake we've made, from things that need to be done for them to do better. That's just my, how do we do that? How do we make that happen? How do we bring in the young people?
Absolutely. We need to create spaces for them and let them lead. Oftentimes, I think we feel like we went through it and we center ourselves. And I think one of the roles that I will be doing with my new role with MCUSA is precisely that, to help identify the younger. They know more about this than sometimes ourselves. When I talk to my daughter and my son about what happened and their political analysis of what is happening now, it is incredible. That's like the things that I knew when I was in my 40s is something that they already know in their early 20s. And so I don't feel that I feel that they have so much insight, but we can share some of our wisdom with the insights and information that they have. And it has to come in deeper relationship with humility. And I see hope when I see some young folks like Daniela leading. If I'm leading, I'm going to attract people that are my age, who look like me, right? We need to allow space for younger people to enter into this space, and not only enter as guests, but as the host. And are we willing to go into those spaces? We need to do this more. And I think this is a place where we have failed as a church on many levels, right? And so you are absolutely right, Femi, that we need to continually bring alongside and let them lead with us. Yeah. I know our time is almost done. I just wanted to invite all of you who are local again to potluck that we're having, as well as worship. I know Ched loves alliteration, and I kind of got this as well now. Tomorrow we will be praising. We will be pilgrimaging. We are 2 blocks away from the epicenter of where the LA uprising broke out. And so we will be walking to the place, and we will be commemorating in that place, only 2 blocks away. We will come back for potluck, and we will be doing some planting to remember Earth Day and to remember the land where we sit, now where we reside in new soil with new planting. And we are also going to distribute some posters that Hae-Yoon has created. So seriously, right? I feel like we just, if it's not a, yeah, Ched and Elaine are giving me the fingers. If you can join us, we would love to have you come. And also to continue to do this work, we invite you to study and to learn together, not just on your own for intellectual exercise, but to gather with people and to have resources like Elaine and Ched's book, Healing Haunted Histories. And I think we even have some discount. Like, do we have like a code, Ched and Elaine, if they want to purchase the book? I think there's a, there you go. So if you go to healinghauntedhistories.org, there is a code that you can use for a big discount, I believe, right?
Yeah, you have to, if you go to the order page, you order
there it is.
from the publisher, and we can give you this discount until the end of this month. So if you can go there, when you hit order, as you're moving through the order page, you'll see there is a place for a discount code. So type it in exactly as you see it here, HHHEV222, and you'll get a 40% off, 40% off the price of the printed copy or hard copy or whatever you want there. So
that's great. And I know a lot of Mennonite churches and gatherings have used this, and I know you have facilitated some meetings. This is an instrumental book to continue the conversation that we just touched upon in this short webinar. We want to thank everyone, especially people on the East Coast and from Japan. Thanks, Yuhiro, for coming. I know that this is really late and it's a Friday night. Many of us are tired from a long week. Thank you so much for being present here. Oh, here it is, Jewel. Thank you for representing the 20s. Yes, Jewel is here representing the Korean Americans. We continue to cheer people like Jewel, people like Daniela, young mothers and parents who are retelling these stories in profound ways. So we want to continue to do this kind of work. Thank you for remembering with us. Thank you for sitting in the hauntings that all of us are experiencing even now. Go in peace. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Feel free to stick around and say hello if you want to say hello to certain folks.
Daniela, did I meet you with Dina? Were you in Kansas City?
I was not. No, we haven't met yet.
Yeah.
Michael,
but it's a pleasure to meet you.
Right. It's good.
Michael is our speaker for tomorrow, and so we would highly recommend if you are here. Michael is really the guru of urban ministries, especially in LA. If you don't know Michael, you really have not done urban ministry work in Los Angeles. Michael, we're so grateful that you'll be with us and joining us tomorrow. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. This was really rich. Thank you all for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peace.
Bye.
Okay.
Elaine.